Okay, looks like we're connected. I don't know who's watching. This is my first time doing a Facebook Live event, so please be patient with me. I've watched other people do it, and it seems pretty straightforward, so I thought this might be a good format to get online and answer some questions about what it's like to be a court interpreter and how to get started. My name is Marco Hansen, and I'm in Austin, Texas. I've been an interpreter for 18 years, and I've been doing court interpreting for 8 years now. Just a little bit about how I got into it. I started out, I grew up in Brownsville on the border in a Spanish-speaking neighborhood and an English-speaking home, and served in the Air Force. And then when I got out, my first job was in customer service, but in a bilingual position. So I spent a lot of my time talking to customers in Spanish and building up the Spanish that I knew at the time, and went through the alternative certification program to become a Texas classroom teacher, and got a bilingual endorsement, which meant that I taught kids in elementary school whose first language was Spanish. And that was a real useful experience for me, because little kids are willing to laugh at you when you make mistakes and criticize you and imitate you, and they have no shame. And so I quickly learned what I was doing wrong, and every day was a learning experience. As I taught these kids to read and write in Spanish, they taught me to speak better Spanish. And after that, the school district had a grant that paid me to go back to grad school and get a Spanish degree. And after that, I was able to start teaching Spanish at the college level, and went overseas and taught ESL there, and then came back and tested for my court interpreter's license. And so since 2010, I've been doing both court interpreting and legal translation. And just a little bit of an explanation of the difference. People tend to use translation for both jobs, but interpreting is verbal or through sign language, and translation is working with written documents. And there's a little bit of overlap, like if you take a piece of paper in one language and you look at it while you're reading it aloud in another language, that's called SiteTranslation, and it's kind of a mix between the two. Or if you listen to a recording, I've got a DVD here of phone calls made by an inmate, and the prosecution sent it to me, and they want me to listen to the recordings in Spanish and transcribe them in Spanish and then translate them into English. Hi, welcome. And so those are cases where an interpreter also translates, and some translators also interpret, but generally people stick to one track or the other. I'm going to recommend that anybody who wants to get into court interpretation also do some legal translation, because it really helps to focus on the details of the language and to build up your vocabulary faster than you would get just sticking to pure interpretation. But I got some good questions here in answer to my survey, some suggestions for what we could cover tonight. And the top requests were the best free and paid study resources, how to find mentors and study partners as you prepare to take the court interpreting exams, how to tell if you're ready and when it's time to go ahead and register and make the plunge and plunk down the money to take the exams. I think it cost, last time I added it up, about $400 for the registration and the background check and the written and the oral test. If you only take each one once, it's going to be a little over $400 currently. And then also how to practice for the exams and what it's like to interpret in court. It's kind of an intimidating situation at first. If you've interpreted before, say in a school setting or for a business or even in a hospital, generally everybody in the room is cooperative and they want the same things. In the court setting, it's generally an adversarial situation where there's two parties going at each other, and so the interpreter is kind of in the middle. We're Switzerland. We're supposed to be unbiased and neutral and just focus on communicating as close as possible what we hear being said. But sometimes the stakes are high. Sometimes somebody's liberty or property or even their life is at stake, and so that can be stressful, and a lot of court interpreters have to find their own ways to let the stress off at the end of the day and debrief with a colleague or a loved one and find a way to just compartmentalize their work life from their private life so they don't carry that burden with them. But I'd like to begin. Hi everybody, Holly, Vanny, Mirta, glad to have you here. And you're welcome to go down to the little comment window down here, which I will demonstrate, typing hello, and write a hi Tony, and throw out questions or comments, and everybody who's following can also read those. So I'm going to start with sort of a walkthrough of free and paid study resources. I'm just going down the list of the most popular topics on the survey. I would say that the best free study resources right now are YouTube. You can go to youtube.com and search for courtroom trials, court proceedings, and find thousands of examples in English or in whatever your other language is, and watch actual live recordings, some taken from TV, some from other materials, and see the type of language that's used in court. In the American court system, a lot of the verbiage is very archaic, and it goes back hundreds of years to the British court system. And people say things in a way, and they say words that we don't use in everyday speech. Things like objection overruled, or forfeiture of bail. There's lots of terms that will be new to you if you aren't already an attorney or a paralegal or a court coordinator or something. And so watching these videos, if you find a video that's interesting, let's start with one that's a few minutes long. You can play the video on YouTube and keep on watching it until you understand everything that's being said. You might have to pause it and look up certain words or get somebody else to help you figure out something that's unfamiliar if it's in your second language. But once you're able to understand everything that you hear, then you play it again with the word processor open and you type up a transcript of everything you hear. And just word for word, including nonverbals like and clearing of the throat. Just create a complete transcript, and then if it's difficult material and there's terms in there that you don't know, you make a second column in your Word document and you type up a transcript in your second language. Let's say it's an English hearing and you're going into Spanish, so you'll type up a Spanish translation of everything that you've heard, and you can go make sure that you understood it all, and any grammar that's complicated, you can get help, or you can research on how to say that. And then once you're comfortable with your translation in the second language, you play the video again and pretend like you're interpreting in court. And everything that you hear, as soon as a sentence or a phrase is finished, just talk right over them, because you're going to have to talk over what you're listening to in simultaneous interpreting, and repeat it or interpret it in the second language, and then see if you can keep up with the whole proceeding. And probably the first time you do this, if people are speaking at a normal speed, to pass the exam, you have to be able to keep up with about 120 words per minute of simultaneous interpreting. But a lot of courtrooms, depending on what part of the country you're in, people might be speaking at 200 words per minute. And so it'll be hard to keep up with them, but it's good to stretch yourself and build up your speed in being able to interpret. Thank you. Good point. And so YouTube is a great place to get real, live, realistic courtroom proceedings to interpret. I would also highly recommend a study course. When I was preparing for my LCI exams, somebody was vacuuming behind me. I hope that's not too loud. I bought all three of the main study courses that were available at the time, and there may be more, and I haven't been keeping up with this lately, but I'll put the links here for the ones that I use. There are companies called eBurkana and Acebo, and the University of Arizona National Center for Interpretation, I believe, which all publish self-study CD courses that come with books, and you can use those to practice the specific skills that you're weak on to get ready for the test. Now, you may be wondering, I don't know what's going to be on the test. I don't know what I need to prepare for. And so before you even invest in a practice course, there's a great resource published by the National Center for State Courts, which is a consortium of, it's like a think tank that helps courts all around the country develop resources and training and materials and statistics. And they're the group that creates and adapts the court interpreter licensing exam that's used in Texas and in, I think, 25 or 30 states now. So they publish materials, including a practice test that you can buy. I think it's $35 or $40, and it's well worth the investment. It comes, when I got it, it was in the mail with a CD. It might be online now. And you take the practice test, follow the instructions carefully, and then you grade it yourself. And one, this really helps you understand what the test is going to be like. And two, it shows you where you're lacking. Maybe you've done a lot of simultaneous interpreting, but you've never done consecutive, and you have a hard time keeping up with that. Maybe you're strong in both of those, but you've never tried sight interpreting, and you realize, I'm not going to be able to sight interpret this page within the time limits required. And so once you figure out what you need to focus on, that helps you work out your study calendar and your plans. Tony says that the Edge 21, which I believe is the Acebo product, is good for practice. It has all three modes. The modes of interpreting on the exams are consecutive, simultaneous, and sight. And consecutive means I'm listening to usually an English speaker or a couple of English speakers talking in court, and they're just going on and on and on without pauses. And either through a headset or by whispering, I'm going, in my case, Spanish continually without pauses, and I have to be able to listen and speak at the same time. Consecutive means often in a deposition or during witness testimony, one person will speak in language A and then wait, and then I'll interpret into language B, and the other person will listen and then answer me in language B, and I'll listen and interpret into language A. And so that just takes different memory skills, different note-taking skills, and you have to practice both modes independently, and some people are better in one and others are better at another. And then sight interpretation, or sight translation, like I mentioned earlier, is looking at a document, and it'll usually be a one-page document in the test. In real life, it can be more. Like here I have a court order, and this is just one that I got in court yesterday. And so it starts out with a description of the cause number, meaning the number for the case, and the style, meaning who is against who. And then it'll have a title, and then it'll have a bunch of very complex and archaic language with really long sentences. And you have to first be able to read it and understand it and comprehend it in the language that it's written, which may be English or it may be in the second language. And then you have to be able to scramble the sentences around into a syntax that makes sense in the second language. And while you look at it, read it aloud as if it were written in the second language. So Vani Sanchez asks if there's a place where she can train in person. I'm guessing you're in Austin, but I'm not sure, Vani. There in Austin, I know that we have an interpreter certificate program at Austin Community College, and you can take several semesters of classes there in translation and interpretation, and some of it is legal translation and court interpretation. Others is just general skills, and you can also focus on medical there. If you're in Houston, last time I checked, there were 2 colleges in Houston that offered interpreter training, and there's at least one in Dallas and another one in Brownsville. I'm from Brownsville, and the University of Texas Brownsville now, UT RGV, has a good interpreter training program, and you can get a bachelor's or master's degree in interpretation and translation studies. San Antonio, at the University of Texas San Antonio, has a variety of interpreter and translation programs. And if you're someplace, if you want to take a college class and they only have translation programs, which is more common, those are still useful, and you'll learn skills that apply to interpretation, and you'll meet other people that may be studying for the same training as you are. So I hope that helps for Vani. Anybody else that just joined us, feel free to jump in with comments or questions, and I'll try to address those. So those are my suggestions on good, free, and inexpensive resources for preparing for the exams. There's also an instructor named Virginia Valencia, who I've heard at do a conference presentation that was very good on note-taking and symbols to use in consecutive interpreting. I've just put up a link to her website there. Daniel Villarreal, all the way from Taipei, glad you could join us. New York University does have online courses. There are several colleges around the United States that have online training, and there are commercial providers of training, and those weren't as available back when I was preparing. I didn't try any of them, but I'm sure that some of them are good. You just have to look at reviews and talk to people. Vani asks if the classes are required. You know, you have to take one 8-hour course called the Texas Court Interpreters Orientation before you can get your license, before you can take the test. That's the only course that's required. You don't have to have a college degree to be a court interpreter. The educational requirements are much more open. Most court interpreters I know have a bachelor's degree. A few have a master's or a PhD. But you could even be a high school dropout, and if you have the skills, you can become a court interpreter. It's kind of like IT. My brother is a self-taught computer programmer, and he does great, and his skills are in high demand even though he hasn't gone to college, because it's one of those fields where the skills are more important than the certificate, than the credential. Vivi, welcome. She asked, for site translation, will you be able to get the document beforehand, or are you to site translate on the spot? In real life, you sometimes can ask for it beforehand. For example, if I'm in a hearing and somebody's going to plea, they have an inmate who wants to accept a plea bargain from the prosecutor so that he or she can get out of jail, then there'll be several pages of forms, and they'll have me sit down with the defendant beforehand and read them aloud in Spanish, in my case. And in that situation, I can review it, I can look through it. Maybe there's some terminology in there I can't remember or I've never seen before, and I can make notes. And on the test, you don't get the page in advance, so you can, in preparation, you'll find out what kind of site translation documents are likely to be in there, and then you can practice with a variety of documents that are like that. But you don't know before you go into the test which ones you're going to end up being handed when it's time to do your site translation. Tony Valle says that on the exam in California, and California uses a different exam than Texas, you get 2 minutes to review the site translation document and then 4 minutes to interpret it aloud. And it's about 200 words, which is just under a page. Thank you. I don't remember, maybe somebody who's taken the Texas test more recently than me could tell us, but it's something similar to that. You get a little bit of time to go over it and interpret it in your head before you have to start doing it out loud. All right, next topic on our top 10 list. I've got all kinds of tabs open on my screen here. How can you find mentors and study partners to help you get ready to become a court interpreter? The good news is that there are about 470, I think 474 licensed court interpreters in Texas. And of those, I would say at least 420 are really friendly people. And they like helping students and beginning interpreters learn about their career field. We are excited about what we do, and we enjoy having the chance to talk about it and share our thoughts. And so just like in any career field, you'll find people who are more helpful than others. But if you go to a courthouse and you see somebody interpreting and you catch them after the hearing and you go up and talk to them, chances are they'll be happy to tell you about what they do. And most of them will say, I'm going to be back here Thursday morning at 9. Why don't you come in and you can watch me interpret, and then afterwards you can see if you have any questions. If you are in a place where maybe you've moved there recently, or you're new to the field of interpreting and you don't know anybody, I would highly recommend joining one of the professional associations. I'm a member of TAJIT. TAJIT is the Texas Association of Judiciary Interpreters and Translators. I've just put up the link there. And I've been in TAJIT for several years, and it's really helped me with my career because of the people I've met there and the training that I've gotten. I go to their annual conference every summer in San Antonio, and I get my continuing ed hours. You're required to have 8 hours a year in Texas, so continuing education. And so I get my continuing ed hours there, and I get to chat with other interpreters and tell funny stories about things that have happened to us. And if you you don't have to be a court interpreter to join. You can, I think it's called an associate membership. You can be a student, you can just be interested in court interpreting, and then you'll still get to plug into the network, and you get on the listserv and get to participate in the discussion. And it's, I don't remember, Christina, is it $40 a year now or $35 a year now? It's a very reasonable fee. And I have met people in Tajit who have been able to answer all my questions, and I know just recently I put out a email to the entire membership, 100 and some members, and had a few respond saying that they were interested in mentoring potential court interpreters and helping them get started. Tony Valle says that he relied on practice partners who shared his goal of getting certified. His practice partner passed the exam together with him because they coached each other to succeed. It's a great strategy. Keith Hayden, I got my mentor by cold calling one of the interpreters in my town, and he's helped me out a lot. Smart. Cristina Sanchez says it's $50 a year to join Tajit. There are other associations. There's NAJIT, the National Association of Judiciary Interpreters and Translators, a much larger network. It costs more. I also recommend NAJIT. And then there are different regional groups. Austin has the AATIA. El Paso has EPITA. The Dallas-Fort Worth area has MITA. Houston has HITA, I believe. And then some of the other types of interpreting, like medical interpreters, have their own association. Sign language interpreters have their own. And in all of them, you can learn and benefit. But if you had to just join one as a beginning court interpreter, I think Tajit would be the most bang for your buck. So that's a good place to find a mentor and study partners. Also, this group that we're all in on Facebook, Become a Texas Court Interpreter, is a place where you can meet other people who are interested in doing the same thing you are or are studying, and you can support each other. It's kind of like, the title of this live stream is, what did I say? Earn $100 an hour as a court interpreter. I do get $100 an hour from some customers. If a law firm hires me to do a deposition, or if certain counties that don't have a lot of demand hire me and they ask me what are my rates, I tell them $100, and usually they'll pay it. Sometimes they're like, I'm going to keep shopping around. But according to the last survey, the average court interpreter in Texas, most of them were Spanish, some were sign language, and there were maybe 5 other languages represented that responded, are getting between $80 and $100, so that's a pretty typical range. I've seen as low as $75 an hour asking rate, and as high as $150 an hour asking rate for Texas court interpreters. People who have the Texas license and the federal certification and spend more of their time in federal court, they're under a different rate structure, and sometimes they can command a higher price from private clients. But if you get your court interpreting license, then you have to either work as a freelancer or as an employee. And most of the jobs are for freelancers. In Austin, for example, there are maybe 4 full-time staff court interpreters, 5. There's 2 who work for the state, 1 in federal court, 2 in juvenile, 1 in criminal court, so 6 now. It keeps creeping up as the state becomes more aware of its obligations to provide language access in the courts. But most of us, so that's 6 full-time positions around the state. Let's say there's 20 people who work full-time as court interpreters. There's another block that works for the courts as a bailiff or a court coordinator or in some other court position, and then interpreting is an additional duty, and they have the credential to do that legally. But the vast majority, maybe 400 of us, are freelancers, and usually we work for a variety of customers. Like personally, I work for maybe 20 or 30 different law firms. About 4 or 5 court reporter agencies will call me when there's a deposition, and they book the videographer and the interpreter and the court reporter. And then I cover different courts in Travis County, and then 2 or 3 counties both north and south of me. And within some of the larger counties, like Travis County is a large metro area, and so I work sometimes in family court, and that's might be 1 one fee that they're willing to pay because they've set their policy, and then sometimes in criminal court, and sometimes in juvenile court, and sometimes in municipal court, sometimes in JP court. And so depending where you are, what jurisdictions you're in, and who you're working for, in Texas at least, it might be different rates for all different groups, and you negotiate them as an individual. And some customers will set what they're willing to pay, others will ask you what you charge, and so you just have to kind of play it by ear and talk to your colleagues and find out what different customers are paying. Tony says that in LA there's a courthouse that has 15 or so full-time interpreters. I believe right now the Bexar County, San Antonio criminal courts have 6 or 7 full-time interpreters, and then they rely on freelancers to make up for the difference. If anybody is here working in San Antonio and can update me, go right ahead. Maribel Garibay says, how much court terminology should I be confident with before taking the test? That's kind of a judgment call. I would say a good glossary of court terminology. Mostly the test, as I recall, was mostly criminal court terminology. There wasn't a lot of stuff like probating wills or juvenile court or traffic court. It was mostly stuff you'd see on TV about violent crimes and weapons and so forth. But how much terminology should you be confident with? Make flashcards. Flashcards are a great resource, and I did paper flashcards back when I was getting ready. But now if you have a smartphone, there are some great court interpreter flashcards pre-made that you can download onto the app. I cut and pasted more than I meant to here. Let me fix this link. An app like Quizlet and other apps like that, and other people who have studied for the court interpreter exams, whether it's a federal one or your state one or some other states, a lot of the vocabulary is the same anyways. You can download their flashcards and just use any spare minute of the day when you're standing in line or waiting at a red light or riding on the bus or waiting for the water to boil at dinner. You can be going over the flashcards and learning a few more words or reviewing ones that you've learned before. Tony Oaye asks, simultaneous is usually a closing argument involving a judge and attorneys. So on the court interpreter exams, a closing argument would be where the judge says, okay, both sides have presented their evidence, and now the last step before the jury leaves to deliberate on the verdict will be the prosecutor in a criminal case and the defense attorney going over, sort of summing up what they believe the evidence has showed and giving their final comments to the jury and encouraging them to rule in their favor. And so you can, if you want to see what that sounds like, visit courthouses in your jurisdiction and listen and take notes, or get online and Google closing arguments, or use one of the training materials like, let's see, Dan Villarreal here is suggesting Holly Mickelson's Acebo course. That's right, lots of good terminology in there, both in her workbooks and in her Interpreter's Edge dictionary. It's a dictionary and phrase book and a set of diagrams of vehicles and weapons and so forth. That is a great reference material for getting ready for the exam, and also once you start practicing as a court interpreter. The site, at least in California, the site translation from Spanish into English is usually a legal document, such as a power of attorney or a sometimes, I can't remember what it was when I took it, but in some of the training materials I've seen, if it's English and Spanish, it might be a police report, a description of a crime, a narrative of what happened that the police is giving, that the police has included in the report. Sometimes it's a legal document from Puerto Rico that's in Spanish, but still similar to the US legal system. All right, so those are some ways that you can get ready for the oral and written exam. The two exams are, first, in Texas at least, a written exam entirely in English. And so that's kind of a screening to make sure that if English is your second language, that you're fluent in English and that you can do things like come up with synonyms for a word, come up with antonyms for a word, that you understand figures of speech, that you know things like a stitch in time saves 9, or out of the frying pan into the fire, that you understand those, because some judges especially love to just sit up there and pontificate and use all kinds of quaint old expressions. Sometimes you'll hear that in a trial too, as part of the closing arguments. Figures of speech come up pretty often. And you don't have to come up with, on the fly, an equivalent figure of speech in your second language, but you do have to understand what it means so that you can interpret the meaning in the second language. We also had a lot of people who were looking for how to evaluate their own level of readiness so they can decide when to register for the exam. I would start with that practice exam that I put the link up here for a little while ago from the National Center for State Courts. And that will tell you very accurately how well you're doing so far. Maybe Tony can tell us if there's a similar product available for the California exam. I've got a link here from Keith. I'll check that out when we're done. waveoftheinterpreter.com. So the written exam is just in English, and then the oral exam is those 3 modes that we've been talking about. So the steps basically are: first, you apply to the JBCC. You should learn this acronym. The JBCC is the Texas Judicial Branch Certification Commission, and they're the state entity that handles the licensing process. In Texas, it's called a court interpreter's license. In other states and federally, it's called a certification, but here it's a license. And the credential that you get is called the LCI, the Licensed Court Interpreter. If you take the written test and pass it, then you're able to go on and schedule the oral test. A lot of people pass the oral test their first time through, especially if they've been real focused in studying just the areas they're weak in and strengthening those. You can keep taking it. It's given a few times each year. I think it's 4 times a year now, and you can schedule to take it again the next time. There's a waiting period, and these policies change from time to time. They've changed since I last looked it up. But if you fail at one time, that's okay. A lot of people do. Then you just figure out what were the hardest areas for you, and you schedule daily training and practice so that next time you'll do better. In California, Tony says the failure rate is 90% plus. In Texas, the last time I ran the numbers, the written test eliminated about 50% of the applicants, and those who passed it and went on to the oral test, that eliminated about 80% of them. So combined, it's about a 90% failure rate too, though you can retake the portions that you fail, either the written or the oral. There's no limit to how many times you can take them, and I've heard legends about people taking them a dozen times, year after year. They just keep on coming back and sitting for the exam, and I don't get that. Like, I think they may need to be studying differently than they are. The main reason people don't pass, the main reason we have this 90% failure rate, in my opinion, from what I've observed, is people who are bilingual and who are able to interpret pretty well. They feel overconfident, and they sign up for it, and they say, well, let's give it a try and see how it goes. And they don't do any focused, targeted, intense preparation, and they go and take the test. And once they get there, they freeze up, and they start stumbling over their words, and they get super nervous because it's an intense situation. You're sitting there with 1 or 2 testers, and they're recording you on various devices, and you've got a lot of money on the line, and you've had sleepless nights leading up to it, and so it's natural to stress out and freeze up, and then all of a sudden too much time has gone by, and you've missed too many of the scoring units, and it's too late, and your heart just sinks, and you're like, oh, why even keep trying? But you keep trying. And so people in that situation might come out feeling so frustrated that they just give up, and they're saying, this is too hard, I can't do it, and they don't go back. Other people take that as a motivation to focus their efforts better next time. And I want to say something specifically about training. Training for the court interpreter exam, if you do it the right way, is like training for a marathon, or training for the bar exam, or training for any really intense, grueling experience that takes months of preparation or years of preparation. And if you say, I know in my state that the exam is going to be given September 1st, and so that gives me 9 months to prepare, 8 months to prepare. I'm going to start getting up a half an hour earlier every morning. I'm going to set my alarm for 6 a.m. now, and I'm going to take my study materials, and I'm going to always study downstairs at the kitchen table. And so before I go to bed at night, I'm going to put my study materials right there, and I'm going to set out a glass of water and a snack so that I won't have any excuse not to just sit down right away and start studying. And I'm going to motivate myself by having my phone, when the alarm goes off, have it flash up and say, study for the LCI exam. And I'm going to have a partner who I'm going to check in with every day and ask, how did your study go? And if I don't call her, she's going to call me and ask, how did your study go? And we're both going to try to encourage each other as we go along. And if you use the tricks that athletes use in training for an athletic event, and you look at this as a marathon that you're running, and take it seriously and do it first thing in the morning so that you can't push it out of the way, rather than last thing at night if you're not exhausted and just want to watch TV. If you do it first thing in the morning when you're fresh, as you know, assuming you've had time to wake up, make your coffee first or go for a walk, then I believe that's the best way to repeatedly on a daily basis focus and hit on the skills that you need, and keep on evaluating how you're doing. You can take the practice test again after 3 months, after 6 months, and see how you've improved. And then based on that, map your strategy, the course that you need to follow until you get up to the exam. We have a comment here from Melissa. Hi, Melissa. A study period for Spanish English examinees over a 15-year period showed that being able to pass a simultaneous exercise was the biggest indicator of overall success. That's good to know. So focus on simultaneous, especially if you haven't done conference interpreting before. Tony Valle recommends a team-based approach so that the other members of the team will support you. It's a great idea if you can find a team, especially if you're in a big city. If you're not, you can have a virtual team and meet online. Hi, Sarah. Welcome. So these are ways to, checklist of the steps to get your Texas Court Interpreter's license. All right, after you apply, you pay an application fee, do a criminal background check. You have to give your fingerprints, and they run you through DPS and make sure you don't have any serious skeletons in your closet. Then you take that 8-hour orientation, and that's given by different providers at different places around the state. The JPCC is where you can go to get the list of providers and sign up for one of those courses. I'm going to put the website up here, if I have it copied and pasted already, for the JPCC. You should read every word on this website. I put together the initial version when I worked for the state, and I'm really proud of it. There's lots of good resources on there, and it's been improved since I left by a couple of my friends who work there now, and it's got links to materials that you can use to study, and providers of education and training, and all the official rules, the statutes for the state of Texas about court interpreting. And those are all things that you should be familiar with before you go in and take the test. Dan Villarreal says, sources for teeny-weeny points of grammar in English and Spanish, like who and whom. Tighten up my shot groups. Thank you for bringing that up, Daniel. Like I said, I didn't realize how much I didn't know about Spanish until I started teaching it. And so I wrote down a few examples here. In English, when you want to ask yourself, is my command of English grammar really strong? Can you explain to someone the difference between I went, I was going, I would have gone, I would have been going, I would have been going to go? Really complex strings of verbs like that. If you can't explain them in both of your languages and you can't interpret from one to the other, then you're not going to be ready for detailed testimony where the expert witness is talking about this crime that may have been believed to have happened. And you may, the interpreting exams aren't heavy on really complex long sentences with detailed verb forms, but once you get into court, you want to be ready for them, because you never know what you're going to have going in. You don't know when you get there what kind of speakers you're going to have there, whether it's going to be ordinary people speaking in everyday language or whether it's going to be attorneys arguing with each other or explaining statutes to the judge in really complex language. If there's going to be expert witnesses talking about things like DNA and ballistics. And so the more you learn about that beforehand, the less terrifying it is and the fewer mistakes that you'll make once you actually get into the courtroom. So over-prepare for the interpreting exam. Since you don't know what's going to be on there, assume it's all going to be on there, and you'll be much more confident when you actually sit down. And when you feel confident, you make fewer mistakes, and you're more likely to pass it on the first go-around. Keith Hayden has recommended some resources on YouTube for Spanish grammar. Good idea. And Holly Beal for English usage. Thank you very much. I'm not familiar with those, but I'll check them out. Okay, back here to my survey. How to practice for the oral exam. We've covered a lot of that. What it's like psychologically and emotionally to interpret in court. That one got 5 votes last time I checked. And so I'd like to move on to that. A lot of the challenge isn't knowledge of the terminology or even ability to interpret fast enough, but it's just feeling confident in front of a crowd in a stressful situation. So if you haven't done a lot of public speaking, if you've never been a teacher or an instructor or a salesperson, then I highly recommend that you find a venue where you can get up in front of people. You could do community theater, you could speak at your religious association, you could join a club like the Toastmasters, you could start doing live Facebook feeds. But the point is that when you get to the courtroom, you're going to be standing up there in front of all these people. Some of them probably are bilingual and will understand what you say and will be evaluating you, and you worry that they're going to be criticizing you. There's a judge right there who's an imposing figure. There's people arguing in front of you, and it's intimidating when you first do it. So in order to build up your confidence, first of all, you want to trust your skills. You want to have put in enough time and practice that you are confident that you know how to interpret what you need to interpret. And then you want to spend time in court. The U.S. has a public court system, which is great for us because that means that you can walk in at just about any courtroom in the country and sit in the back, sit in the front row if you want, take a notebook and take notes. And you can listen to any proceeding, any plea, any hearing, any prove-up, any trial, any appeal, anything you want. It's all out in the open there. And the more types of courts you visit, the different levels of the court system, like here in Texas, we have district courts and county courts at law and county courts and probate courts. And there's certain specialty veterans courts and there's a juvenile court system. And so the more different kinds of courts that you visit and the more hearings that you sit in on, hearings and trials, and the more notes that you take and the more flashcards you create from the terminology that you hear, the more confident you feel once you get into your very first court setting. And I just have to tell a story. The first time I was interpreting in court, this was back in 2010, I just got my credential. It's like the best day of your life when that thing comes in the mail. And so I had already started networking with other court interpreters. I put out the word that I'm now licensed and I'm ready to go, and who wants to hire me to interpret something. And the first call that I got might have been from you, Christina Sanchez, because it was in the juvenile courts here. And they said it was from an agency, one of the interpreting agencies. They said we need an interpreter for Adoption Day at the Travis County Courts. And Adoption Day is the best day to be in court. It's the only day when everybody's happy. And in fact, they have balloons and clowns and flowers and stuffed animals all over being given away. And these kids are formalizing their adoptions to their new parents. And so everybody's real excited. And the judges are in a great mood and they're telling funny stories. And so I got called into a courtroom where the TV station, Telemundo, was going to be filming the adoption for the Spanish-speaking family. And the first thing the judge said was, I'm glad we have an interpreter here because I have a poem that I'd like to share. And so interpreter, interpret this poem, please, on camera. And if you've ever tried to translate or interpret poetry, It's hard. There's all kinds of layers of meaning that you want to try to convey in the second language, and figures of speech and metaphors and imagery, and I was just frozen on my spot. You want me to do not only poetry, but you want me to do it live on TV? And so that was an unforgettable day, both the good of Adoption Day and the bad of having to interpret poetry on TV. And I didn't try to make it rhyme in the Spanish, of course, and I didn't try to carry over any of the colorful imagery. I just got the idea across and didn't leave out any of the major content. And so it turned out fine, and everybody was just happy. They're all in such a good mood. Nobody's going to criticize your interpretation on Adoption Day. So if you ever get called to Adoption Day, go. That's the best time to be a court interpreter. On the other hand, I would say most of the time that I'm interpreting, it's not an intense and stressful situation. It's not any ugly crime. There aren't people upset and crying. Usually it's a very formal level of language being spoken, and everybody's being polite and respectful, and they understand the interpreter needs extra time, and they'll pause. And so I would say usually court interpreting, once you get confident, is a pretty positive environment to work in. I'm sure some people will argue with that, and maybe if you're a full-time interpreter and you just do one certain type of court, maybe it's a real different situation for you. But being a freelancer, you get to travel around, and you can turn down jobs you don't want. Some interpreters say, I just hate everything to do with child abuse cases, and so if I get booked and I find out that it's going to be an ugly child abuse case, I'm going to turn it down. You can do that as a freelancer. You can say, no, I'm not available. You don't even have to explain why. You can just say, no, I can't take that job, and then they'll call the next person on the list. All right. So psychologically and emotionally, sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's educational. I would say it's always educational. One of the unexpected benefits that I've gotten from interpreting at depositions is most depositions are about car accidents. And every time I come away from a deposition, first of all, I'm reminded to drive more carefully. But second, I learn about some traffic law I didn't know, or some way that you can get in trouble while you're driving. And so I would say I become a better driver, and not a better citizen, but just so much more aware of how people can get in trouble by working on a regular basis in the court system and learning from other people's mistakes. I know, well, I better not do that. And I come home at dinner and I tell my kids, so-and-so got in trouble for such and such. I mean, you don't say the names. What you interpret for in court remains confidential, but you can say in general terms, somebody in court today was charged with this, and I didn't even know that was a crime, or they got caught because of this, and I never thought that could really happen in real life. And so it's sort of like the entertainment of watching court TV in some cases, and yet you're really part of it and you're involved in it, and so it's much more exhilarating. Hi, Dorian. Welcome. Good evening. Marketing was the next item on the list. Now we're sort of crossing over the first, let's split this into two phases. The first half of the process is preparing for the exams, passing the exams, and getting your credential. The second half of the process is what do you do once you have that credential? And unfortunately, the world doesn't come knocking on your door and saying, please interpret for me. I have $100 here and it'll only take an hour. Let me hire you. It's a much more active approach that you need to take to marketing yourself. So once you become an interpreter, you're going to keep on working on your skills, but your focus shifts from studying over to marketing, and you become a salesperson selling yourself. You are your product, the service that you provide. And any background you might have in business or sales comes in handy, because you'll probably be a self-employed sole proprietor. You'll be doing your own bookkeeping. You'll be setting up your own web presence. You'll be I recommend taking a professional photo, getting a headshot that looks really good, because you are going to be live and in person, and the people who hire you will remember your face better than they'll remember your name. And if you give them a business card and a LinkedIn profile that has a good picture on there, then they'll associate it with that person who interpreted so well for them last time, and then they're more likely to call you the next time. So right away, get a headshot, put it on your business card. Give that business card out every time you do anything. When I'm in court, I always give it to the attorneys that I interpret for and the court reporter. The court reporter likes to have the card so that he or she can spell your name correctly in the record. If I go to a deposition, I hand it out to everybody in the room, basically. And sometimes I get calls back from those business cards that I've passed out, and if not, at least I know that they're holding on to it. And if I made a good impression, hopefully each time you interpret, you treat it like an audition. The first time you interpret for someone, it's your job interview, so to speak. And if they're happy with your accuracy and with your attitude, then they'll probably just default to you next time they need an interpreter. They'll be like, oh, so-and-so did great last time. I'll just call him again. So marketing is a whole other world that we didn't have time to get into tonight. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. Holly Beal, who's online here, got me started on Audible, the Audible app, and downloading audiobooks. What was that, 2 years ago? What was that book called, Holly? One that you sent to all the Tajit board members? Switch. Switch was the name of the book, and it's about how organizations change effectively. But after that, I just started downloading every month a new book on running your own business, on online marketing, motivational stuff like Tony Robbins, and I listen to that every day now, and I'm always getting great ideas from other people who are running their own businesses, usually in other career fields, but most of it applies to marketing your translation and interpretation business. So I would like to do a whole live hour later on just on marketing, especially for people who are already court interpreters and want to grow their business, but that's beyond the scope of tonight. Court interpreting in languages other than Spanish. I believe that Texas has 10 or 11 other languages other than Spanish. Most of them just have between 1 and 4 interpreters working that language. So I know we have a Vietnamese interpreter on tonight. I don't know if any other languages are represented, but your task in another language will be different than a Spanish interpreter because you'll have to cover a much broader geographic area. You'll have to build in travel expenses to your quotes, and you might want to get into video remote interpreting and telephonic interpreting so that you can have a presence in places where you're needed, but they're not willing to pay your travel expenses or you're not able to travel. You might also supplement your interpreting income with a lot more translation. Translation of documents, I use it to fill in the cracks. I might have 2 hours of interpreting today, and then the other 6 hours I spend translating a document that somebody has sent me or evidence that somebody has given me a couple months to prepare. I can just work in that in pieces between my interpreting sessions. And by using those as building blocks, I'm able to fill up a whole day and make a lot more than somebody who is just interpreting, and when they're not interpreting, they're looking for their next interpreting job. If you enjoy translating and interpreting, then it diversifies your portfolio of services that you can offer. So time and financial investment to plan for, that only got 1 vote. I won't get into that. But we're almost out of time, and I would love to take a couple more questions from you guys and see what else you're interested in. If you are watching this later on, I'll be checking back every day and seeing people who viewed the video if they had any comments to add. And I'm thinking this would be fun to do on a regular basis, maybe once a month, have a presentation here or in some other. So I know some people aren't on Facebook, so we might try another platform that's easier for more people to watch. Daniel Villarreal has a comment for the Vietnamese interpreter. Let Bexar County know who you are. Yes, you bring up a good point. According to Texas statute, if you're in one of the 50 largest counties, the 50 metro counties that have more than, what's the cutoff, 50,000 people? I can't think of it because I'm tired. But if you're in a large metro county and you're a Spanish interpreter, then the judges and attorneys are required to use you unless there are no Spanish interpreters available within 75 miles. But if it's an interpreter in a non-Spanish language, then they have a lot more flexibility. They don't have to use a licensed interpreter. I'm simplifying here, but non-Spanish interpreters can work without the license in a lot of situations. And in smaller counties, any language, including Spanish, can work without a license in 200 counties around Texas. And so if you don't have a license but you have strong interpreting skills, one good way to get better is to go to a little county that doesn't need to hire a licensed interpreter and start offering your services. Of course, you don't want to do criminal cases, anything where you're out of your depth, but if it's traffic court, if it's JP court, if the stakes are low, then the court will probably normally be hiring non-licensed interpreters. And if you have the abilities and if you can demonstrate them and if you sat in on other hearings and feel confident that you understand the language being used, start interpreting in court. And it'll only build your skills while you continue studying to get the credential. And then once you have the state license, you'll be able to go to any court in the state that's not federal court. And in fact, sometimes you can go to federal court if they can't find a federally certified interpreter. They'll hire a state licensed interpreter to fill in. Volunteer. Tony makes a great point. There's so many good opportunities working with refugee associations and asylum associations. There's lots of groups, legal clinics that need free interpreters, and that's a place where you can go to, one, help people in need, and that feels great, and two, build up your skills and your confidence as you prepare to take the interpreting exams. Tony worked as an interpreter at teen court. Teen court is where, as the ones that I've seen, is where teenagers actually run the whole court, and the defendants are teenagers who are guilty of curfew violations or traffic violations, and the teenagers themselves decide the punishment, and then they assign them usually community service or something. That would be a fun place to work. So we are just about out of time. Thank you, Vivi Sasaki, for your comment, and Judith Vitya Caraveo. I appreciate that. I am looking forward to hearing from you. You can comment on the Facebook page, on this feed. You can put a comment on our Become a Texas Court Interpreter page, or you can email me. My email links are available through clicking on stuff on Facebook. You can find me. And I would be glad to help you out more and help you on your journey. I'm doing this, and I just want to close by saying I'm not selling anything, but I personally am concerned because I see the LEP, the limited English population in the state, going up while the number of licensed interpreters are going down. The reason is, in 2001, when the interpreter licensing program was created, there were hundreds of acting court interpreters who didn't have to take the exam. They were called grandfathered, and they just had to have, I believe, a letter of recommendation from a judge saying that they were proficient in court interpreting. And they got in, and they got their credential for life, and they just have to maintain it with their 8 hours of continuing ed each year. But this group is slowly not renewing, retiring, leaving the profession, and as they depart, the people who are actually taking the test, which now makes up about half of the court interpreters, aren't keeping up with the replacement level. And so every year we need more, the demand gets higher for court interpreters. And it's good for those of us who are already court interpreters. On one hand, I mean, I've got all the work that I can handle, and so you might say I should just let that sleeping dog lie, but it hurts to be there in situations where I see no interpreter available, and some judges illegally will just let somebody else interpret, or they will let the attorney interpret for both parties, or sometimes, worst case scenario, it'll be like a domestic violence dispute, and they let the alleged abuser interpret for the alleged victim, and some terrible cases of bias. And as you get more involved in the system, you see that happening more and more, you just really long for there to be more good court interpreters out there. And so this broadcast, this whatever you call it, live feed tonight is hopefully a little attempt to get more good people into the track headed towards the court interpreting field, and giving them the encouragement they need to keep trying. Melissa Wallace, fantastic. Aw, thank you. I appreciate everybody being here, and I'm gonna turn in now. You all have a good night, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.